Thank you very much, Stephen. And I want to just to acknowledge, Auntie Caroline's left us, but I wanted to acknowledge the beautiful welcome to country that she provided for us earlier, and of course join the Minister in his acknowledgement of the traditional owners of this land. And also acknowledge Minister Conroy for spending time with us this morning. A couple of things that he said really chimed with me. They're important. His comment before about locally engaged staff for all of us, and I know many of you who serve overseas with the Australian government or with other entities. The locally engaged staff are really the heart and soul of the work we do. We rely on them, we count on them, and our work couldn't happen in the way it does without them. Thanks, Stephen and the ANU Development Policy Centre for hosting us today. It's no shame to be confused with Rod Hilton. Rod's a great colleague, and of course he's now High Commissioner of Solomon Islands, which adds to the confusion between us. I appreciate you all joining us for the forum today, which DFAT is pleased to be co-hosting with ANU ACFID and the IDCC. As Stephen said, I've been very closely involved in preparing the new development policy, the performance and delivery framework, and the development finance review. By no means the main contributor, but playing my role with dozens of excellent colleagues in the department, many of whom are here in the room today. But of course, many of you from outside government also contributed brilliantly to that policy. Several colleagues, Joe Cho was on the expert advisory panel with Stephen and others. We did hundreds of consultations with stakeholders, and they were very rich experiences. But I want you to know that wasn't box ticking; it was authentic consultation, and we took that very seriously and spent a lot of time on it. It's been a huge undertaking for the department, and we are all very proud of the product. It was very exciting for me, and I know it was for many of you too, when they were launched by the Foreign Minister and the Minister Conroy. If those of you who were in the room, you would have seen that the shadow ministers were also there. Some Michael McCormack were also there. So someone who's been for more than 20 years had some association either at the very distant downstream end of the Australian aid program as a recipient of grants to being in this position now. It was a very poignant moment. I'm really pleased the development policy and the delivery framework and the development finance review have been so well received by partners and the public. It shows we're on the right track. I know that many of you do have further contributions you want to make. You're watching us very carefully on implementation, but I really do thank you for the very constructive way you have welcomed this new policy. We know, though, that we'll be judged on the impact of the policy, and Mr. Conroy, what he said to you around implementation is absolutely right. He has shifted very quickly from the production and launch of the policy to ensuring that the department is now fully focused on the very, very important and complex business of actual implementation. I really welcome the opportunity to gather here with the development community to discuss how we can work with you on that implementation. I want to make three broad points about the new policy. I don't think the first will be a surprise to those of you who've been paying attention, but it's not business as usual. It's the first long-term development policy in more than a decade, or almost a decade. We needed that to account for not just a new policy direction from the Albanese government, but we have for the first time in 10 years a growing budget. The government added $1.7 billion to the base. In the last budget, they made a 2.5% indexation a permanent feature of the forward estimates. But the policy also needed to account for the emergence of new tools. We've come to think of the ODA program or the development program as consisting of the $4 billion or $4.77 billion as it is at the moment in grant financing, but it's gradually acquired new tools. We now have the Australian Development, the grants that were formerly known as EMIF, the ADIs, which the Minister just mentioned. These the capitalisation of this has gone from very small amount, $30 million, to around $240 million. So that's still small. But the key feature of that is that we have been able to mobilise for every $1 of Australian government funding, about $6 or $7 of private sector funding for investments in the region with a gender and or climate focus. So it's thinking about development beyond the grant component, which is contemplated by this policy. So we're setting a platform to rebuild and revitalise the development program, and the new policy puts this government's blueprint on international development, articulating Australia's unique offering as a development partner, drawing on our national strengths, assets and capabilities, reiterating our emphasis on partnership and listening, engaging respectfully and responding to the priorities of our partners, and bringing development to the core of Australia's foreign policy approach, as the Minister mentioned. The new development policy provides a platform to develop genuine partnerships with countries in our region, and it's through that process of listening very carefully that we want to achieve that. These are underpinned by the government's continuing commitment to the 2030 agenda and the Sustainable Development Goals. These are important to remember and emphasise as we approach High Level Week in New York next week, where high priority for Minister Wong and those of us who will be there to emphasise the core importance of the Sustainable Development Goals to global development and the critical norms that sit at the core of those. Our new policy has 30 new commitments backed by ambitious targets that will drive reforms in how we work, on driving locally led solutions, on gender equality and climate, and on monitoring, evaluation and learning to improve the effectiveness of what we do. And we've started preparing new strategies on gender equality, disability equity, LGBTQIA+ rights, and a refreshed policy on our humanitarian action. We're also developing our approach to First Nations engagement, led by the Ambassador of First Nations People, Justin Muhammad. We want to explore new ways of working with First Nations people in development and to establish genuine partnerships. We've started scoping work to explore different approaches, including what we can learn from First Nations experiences in domestic policy and program implementation. And we plan to reach out in the coming weeks to exchange ideas on embedding foreign First Nations perspective into development policy and program. Of course, the right mix of financing will be the key to our development program's success. Implementing the Development Finance Review's recommendations will boost our partnerships with impact investors and philanthropists, encouraging greater flows of private finance towards development outcomes in the Indo-Pacific. There are very high expectations from ministers, from you, in in the development sector and from the Australian public that we will deliver. And that's why we're very keen to continue the discussion with all of you today about how we can best work to align our collective effort. The second broad point is that we need to be creative in thinking about what development means. Development is a very complex business. We've all been in it for a long time. And delivering a program that is more effective and more responsive to partner countries' needs, we must remain open-minded and be prepared to constantly learn from experiences and evolve our practices. It will take time, but one priority for me is to support colleagues at post to be engaging intelligent legal contract management, not in a legalistic or box-ticking fashion, but with our policy purposes and goals at the forefront. Be patient with us. I know that's a concern for some in the community. We hear you and we want to improve on that score. In designing the new policy, we made a conscious decision to move away from a traditional sector-based approach. We know that the fundamental building blocks of development are health, education, infrastructure, good governance, and private sector development, but we recognise that we need to take a holistic view of a country's development trajectory and recognise differences from country to country. Increasingly integrated and cross-cutting approaches will be needed. For example, building effective health systems isn't just about building hospitals, training staff, or strengthening policy and regulatory systems. Increasingly, we're having to involve strengthening IT systems, for example, which many countries consider part of their critical infrastructure, protecting them against cyber intrusions, for example. If an IT system is compromised, it can cause severe disruption to essential services for communities. We encourage you, our development partners, to help us think creatively about approaches that reflect our increasingly complex development challenges. Finally, implementation will take time. All of our country programs are on different timetables with their partner governments. We all know that there's a lot of impetus around existing programs. But we also know there's a sense of excitement about the new policy and a sense of urgency to move forward with implementation. I personally have never felt such a sense of shared purpose and support as I've seen over the past few months. I really mean that, and we want to harness this energy. We want to be as consultative and transparent in policy's implementation as we have been in its preparation. This means, for example, taking time in the preparation of the new development partnership plans. That's why we've given ourselves until the end of next year to finalise and publish them, because genuine and equal engagement with partners will take time and there are practical barriers. Enhancing quality, transparency and accountability will take a sustained effort, not just at the front end of those partnership plans. We've begun work in a range of areas, developing a monitoring and evaluation and implementation plan, preparing the new performance of Australian Development Cooperation report is underway, scoping the requirements for the new online transparency portal, and we're taking forward these new commitments at the same time as we're continuing to deliver on the government's ongoing agenda. You'll be interested that tomorrow Minister Conran is giving a pep talk to heads of mission who have development programs. He wants them personally to lead the development of these partnership plans. I'm really optimistic. I know that we have a strong platform. There are many colleagues from DFAT in the room today as well, joining online, and I want to thank you as your colleague for the tremendous work that you've done. I've been involved in a lot of processes like this, and this is hands down the best I've been involved with, and it's due to the professionalism of my colleagues DFAT that we've achieved this. We look forward to our discussions today as a springboard for further consultation. And I really do encourage you to engage frankly, ambitiously and creatively. Please challenge us and challenge yourselves. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Rod. Thank you for that overview and for that invitation. It's a great springboard to the next session into the rest of the day. The rest of the day is now to be given over to us to four panel discussions. So we've got the first one, and then we'll go break the morning tea. But it is going to take a little while to get set up here in front. So if you want to stretch your legs, don't go outside. Realising our shared commitment to locally led action partnerships, our locally led development, then the lunch. Panel 3, inclusive development, then afternoon tea, and then panel 4, performance, accountability, and transparency. So each panel goes for approximately an hour and a half. I think we break for morning tea at 10:50, so slightly we've got an hour and 20 minutes for our first panel. And it's really up to each panel how they organise the session, but definitely the aim is to have a lot of audience participation. So it's not just people talking at you; it's meant to be interactive. And we are, of course, everyone here in the room, but we're also we're now switching to Zoom. So we have people joining on Zoom, so welcome everyone who's joined online, and you will be able to take part if you're on Zoom. We have a Slido set up, which I'm sure everyone is aware of. So please do, and we'll be also feeding those comments, questions to the panel. So in the spirit of myself being saying as little as possible, I'm only going to introduce the chair of each panel, and I'll leave it to the chair to introduce the panel members. So the chair for our first panel on investigative resilience is Bernadette, who's the CEO for Asia and Pacific for Alinea International. So over to you, Bernadette. Please welcome our first panel.
Thank you very much. I think I've been promoted because I'm like CEO for Asia and Pacific, rather than Alinea International Asia and Pacific, which is fun. So I'm delighted to be here today, especially on this panel, because the new policy, the new international development policy, aims to reach 80% of new investments having a climate change objective, in addition to a range of other ambitions that we've talked about here today. It's an exciting time to be working in development and going forward after the last decade, which is like, that's what we always call it, the last decade, shrouded somewhat. But I'm delighted to introduce you to our panel. We've got Chell Lyons first up, who is, I'm going to read this because otherwise, who is with the Alinea Sir Roland Wilson Scholar and Research Fellow with Lowy Institute. Matt Spannagle, who is Director of Climate and Nature, Asia and the Pacific for Palladium. Anthea Spinks, who's the Director of Programs at Oxfam. And Cate, Assistant Secretary, Climate Resilience and Finance Branch, DFAT. So each are going to talk for a little while, and then I will have a discussion and invite people to ask questions or just join the discussion. So over to you, Chell.
Well, it's absolutely wonderful to be here today, and I wanted to start by acknowledging that we're in a rural country, and to someone who works on climate change, I spend so much time being so grateful for the beautiful land which we are. So I'd like to pay my respects to others past, present and emerging. And as someone who has spent time working on domestic climate change policy, I thought it was very appropriate to start by acknowledging what a fantastic success the policy has been. I started back in 2009, and I would say sometimes policy processes do not turn out exactly as they're envisaged at the time. And so I think, you know, the great consultation and great work of the development community in DFAT really should be acknowledged at the outset of the panel today. Now I had some nice talking points, but I've kind of thrown most of those out the window based on the minister's discussion, because I thought it was really engaging and very interesting. And so I wanted to start off with his final the three challenges that he set out. And the third one around the potential to improve and promoting a culture within the framework that rewards transparency. And this is something that we really are focused on a lot in the work that we do at the Indo-Pacific Development Centre at the Lowy Institute. And one of the recent sort of projects that has been released is the Southeast Asia aid map. And that has been a huge sort of improvement on the sort of transparency around aid in general. But I wanted to talk a little bit about the story that it tells around energy development and finance in the region, because I think as one of the areas where energy demand growth is fastest growing, there's, you know, a lot of opportunity for Australia to do more and to play to our strengths in that area. And so, you know, approximately 3/4 of global emissions come from the energy sector, and decarbonising to get to net zero is heavily dependent on investments in energy infrastructure. And the Lowy Southeast Asia aid map shows that since the Paris Agreement, we've actually had fossil fuel infrastructure investments in the region receiving twice as much funding as renewable energy infrastructure. Which is a big concern given that these assets are long-lived and need to be significantly scaling up renewable energy. So I think that, you know, obviously having the data and the transparency to be able to understand where the need is really critical. But there's also, you know, an enormous both investment challenge associated with getting that capital out the door and addressing the barriers adequately to de-risk that capital. But then the second challenge that is intertwined with that, and which I know some of the other panelists today will be talking about more, and I'm excited to discuss too, is the enormous skills challenge that we have there. Now, the second challenge that Minister Conroy pointed out were the difficult choices that we have to prioritise. And, you know, as a PhD sort of scholar on secondment from DECU, my background is in developing emissions models and projections and doing a lot of this sort of analytics work. So, you know, I think there's a very great need to think about new forms of evaluation that allow us to trade off between different policy priorities and understand those trade-offs in better ways. And, you know, in my work, I'm doing a lot around, you know, how we can better use multi-criteria decision analysis as a framework for doing that. So any, you know, evaluation nerds out there wanting to have a discussion about that, very happy to talk more. And I think the final sort of area that he sort of raised around doing local partnerships differently, I think it is really critical, and, you know, I am very excited to sort of talk more about that in the panel as well. So my area of research really looks at mobilising additional private sector investment. So I'm looking at how the public green bank model, so Australia's CFC and other green banks around the world, could be diffused more broadly into the Asia Pacific region or adapted. And so, you know, I think I would say mobilising that additional private sector investment is critical, but to effectively leverage it, we need to do two things. So firstly, you have to remove the investment barriers, and I think one of the ways that we can do that is through increasing knowledge and transparency. Matt made that great suggestion about, you know, having more of those closed door kind of chamber discussions, similar to DFAT. Another, you know, suggestion I'd like to throw into the mix is looking at the work that the Australian Renewable Energy Agency, ARENA, did around scaling up large-scale solar. And they actually released a huge series of reports as part of that round, where they sort of showed shared knowledge within the large-scale solar development sector to show, what were the barriers to getting projects in that round completed on time. How could you actually develop projects more effectively? So I think knowledge sharing and transparency is really very critical as well. And then the second thing, obviously, is that skills challenge. And so the last thing I just wanted to say quickly was that, Australia should be playing to its strengths around, renewable energy, as it sort of supports climate finance development in the region. And we do have significant strengths around, emissions monitoring, reporting, verification, and renewable energy deployment. So very actually looking forward to discussing further.
Thank you so much. Yeah,
Do you want to questions at the end is where you go?
Yeah, I think.
Great. Hi everyone, thanks for being here. My name is Spannagle. I'm the Director of Climate and Nature in Palladium, which is an implementing partner of several DFAT programs. The question is pretty broad. Where to from here? We can take that wherever we like, but I thought I'd take 3 points to talk about in relation to climate resilience and some suggestions and discussion points of where we go from here. And the first one, I used to work in Aussie back in the day, around 10 years ago, and I've been living outside of Australia. After the government came in, I was climate change advisor for Aussie, so that didn't seem like a very good future. So I left the country for some time, returned in December last year, and really such a change from the previous 10 years of obfuscation and you can't say the word climate. So it's really a great environment to come back to, honestly, but we've got a lot of catching up to do. And before I left Aussie, I was in this room, and I think it might have even been this event, and it was about, the question was something broad like, how do we do adaptation, something like that. So in preparation for that, I did some big reviews and research to try and find, what's the one thing that really drives effective adaptation, and there isn't one thing. Surprise, there's no silver bullet. But the thing that I found that had the highest correlation for communities, regions, and countries that had the highest level of resilience in the face of changes was gender empowerment, so women's empowerment. And so if you want to look for a silver bullet, educate girls. That would be the single greatest thing you can do to increase resilience. But obviously that's a long-term play. So for where we are now and how we implement this development policy, I think it's also about having coherence in society. So it's not only about women's empowerment, although that is critical. It's also about ensuring that the vulnerable groups and disabled people and Indigenous people, those that generally don't have the kind of voice that some of us might enjoy, says the white man. Those that don't have the same powers that we enjoy need to be included to ensure that we have a coherent society. And with a coherent society, you have the ability to respond to changes and disasters and impacts that climate change will inevitably bring. So I don't have an answer, but I'd like to kind of have a discussion around how do we include Gen Z and LGBTQIA+ more generally into our policies beyond just gender inclusion and data and counting gender. So how do we take more substance around that? Is my first point. My second point is around, climate change resilience versus general resilience. So the way you make people better is, as I said, you empower women, but you also make them richer and better educated. Australia is a much more resilient country because we're wealthy and well educated compared to, for example, Indonesia. We don't have quite as many disaster challenges as Indonesia as well. But that's not the same as climate change resilience. For climate change resilience, we need to understand what the hazards are that are faced at that particular location. So we need to get the sort of information that's applicable in this place so that we know, are we responding to a hotter, drier climate, or are we responding to a hotter, wetter climate, for example? The things that we would do will be different. Fortunately, with 10 years of not taking any real policy action, the government's focused its attention on how do we measure things. So Australia is actually pretty good at downscaling and climate modelling and how they're applied and what it means in the local environment. If you look at the mapping and the downscaling and resolution in PNG, for example, it's as good as it is here in Canberra. It's incredible. And the prediction systems are really first class, best in the world. So we need to be able to use those and apply those to get the what is the local impact that's going to be seen here, so that when we do development programs and processes, we can respond to the hazards that aren't going to be manifest. And let's not kid ourselves, they are going to be substantial and real. And this summer in PNG, it's going to be a tough one for food security. So how do we get ahead of that? How do we use our modelling to make sure that we've got the equipment and humanitarian responses in place, as well as the human responses to prepare for that? I think is an area we can use Australia's strengths to apply a more effective development program. I think I would be remiss not to say the best adaptation approach is rapid, large-scale mitigation starting now would also be a pretty helpful thing to do. The third and final point I wanted to make was around, and Chell alluded to it, is the human capacity. For those of us working in companies and I'm sure government counterparts, finding good people that are able to start soon is tough, right? Like, it's just finding talent and retaining talent is a real challenge. So how do we ensure that we build that capacity in Australia so that we can effectively operate? But how do we ensure that we build that capacity parallel in our neighbours where we'll be working? So you can't have the localisation agenda without having effective people to work with. So what does that look like? And I think there's some dots to join between the AID program or the DFAT program writ large. For example, the Australia Awards that we work with have, it's kind of the volition of the people taking the award as to what they want to do with it. But how could we incorporate our development policies into that? How could we include GEDSI and climate and localization into that awards program? What could we do to make that happen? I don't know, but there's got to be an avenue there somewhere so that we can have effective partners to work with. We want to work with our development partners, but we have to have the capacity to be able to work effectively. So trying to explore ways using the existing aid program to leverage that to how we can get more effective partnership engagement capacity would be my third point to consider. And I don't think I've answered any questions, just raised more issues for questions. But that's it for me. Thank you.
So if you do have questions, not want to just
Lovely, thanks, Matt. Morning, everyone. As Bernadette said, I'm Anthea Spinks, and I'm the Director of Programs at Oxfam Australia. And I too would just like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of this land, and indeed all our lands, and Indigenous and First Nations peoples globally. We can't have a conversation about development policy, and particularly climate and investing in resilience, without acknowledging traditional knowledge, traditional custodians, traditional practices, and the thousands of people across the world who care for country, land, water and culture. And so really pleased actually that not only the current policy but also the Australian government and DFAT are really focused on an Indigenous and First Nations policy, and we see that in the development policy. We don't yet know what that means, and I think Oxfam in particular and many other parts of the sector are really keen to work with First Nations people and allies in Australia and across the region to really explore what does that look like. We use locally led development. In a lot of places that will be First Nations led development, and so we really need to I think be very intentional and very serious about that process, the learning that we can take from that, but also the ability to actually understand and achieve more impact through the work that we do. So we do want to acknowledge that. I have spent a lot of my career crossing the boundaries between policy and practice, particularly as it relates between humanitarian action, development policy, what is now framed the nexus. It used to be called the continuum. We've got lots of different words that we use to describe the relationship between our development assistance. And so again, I think it's really exciting and important that we can take those opportunities into the implementation. I was very keen to hear the Minister's words this morning about the focus now rapidly needs to shift to implementation, because that is where it will get real. That's where it will get exciting, that's where it will get hard, and that's where we will be challenged, hopefully in really positive ways, to think about our own practice very differently in terms of the lessons that we're learning and how we're bringing voices into those spaces. I just returned on the weekend from a week in Timor-Leste, where I was privileged to meet with a lot of my colleagues and partners, some amazing partners working particularly on disability inclusion and gender action in climate and climate resilience related programs, and really taking away a lot of messages from those women and communities around the role that they play and the role that they want to play in the learning and the reflection. So I think one of the challenges we're going to face in wanting to, and Brian, I think you asked the question before in terms of how do we get cover, and we get cover by demonstrating impact, but impact is hard. And if we're talking about really locally led conversations and locally led solutions, you need to have locally led conversations around impact. What does impact mean to people that the aid program is supporting will vary. It will vary from community to community, household to household. We know we're not very good at rolling up because we want a big, short, sharp picture of what that impact looks like, and we need it. We need it to demonstrate, you know, why those programs are working and why they should continue, or why they're not working, and what those conversations and those frank conversations around failure need to be. But if we risk just walking at the point of design and not then through how do we actually engage communities in the local, in the locally led conversation around impact, we've only done one part of what I think the policy is referring to. So for me, that would be one of the challenges, and particularly in the context of investing in resilience, because you can have some counterfactual conversations about resilience. You can, you know, the DFAT's got some great pilots at the moment around anticipatory action, which I think would be really exciting to see how can they build on the conversation around impact. But there's also, you know, on the other side, which is we don't necessarily always know what we're doing now is going to have the most impact. We can have the modelling, we can have a lot of really great methodologies, but we've also got to trust that all the way through, they're not going to have other wins that come and impact their success of those. So how are we being able to adapt our own ability to measure that impact? I think is one of the challenges, you know, of the sector. It's not a new challenge. I think it's really exciting though that this policy is putting that front and centre, or the implementation of it is putting it front and centre. I might just also touch on something that the Minister also briefly mentioned, I think, and then I think Rod might have also alluded to this as well, is in many parts across our region, we do have a shrinking or a restricted civil society and civic space. And so how do we really engage in meaningful conversations about partnership, and partnership at all those levels, where we're actually also finding some quite drastic constriction of that civic space? And so who is at the table and who is being part of that conversation, I think will be increasing challenge for us. And so therefore comes back to the who are we being led by in terms of those voices in conversation, but also the ability to actually have impact. The policy is very clear that it doesn't see an investment in governance and fragility as being important, and particularly in this region. So again, from investing in resilience, the impact of our climate initiatives and our humanitarian and development program really need to be seen in balance and in tandem with the spaces that those, particularly NGOs and our civil society partners, are operating in. And so I think that's going to be increasingly a challenge for us, because it also leads to something that's no surprise to everyone, very deep to Oxfam's heart, in terms of increasing inequality. So we can have great sort of meta metrics that might be showing the impact that we're achieving, but when we're also seeing inequality and poverty actually on the rise for the first time in decades, we really need to be looking at those granular stories of where that maybe that meta impact is not evenly felt and evenly awarded to the people that we're supporting. The final thing I'll say, I think, is also really exciting, but also a challenge. there are clumpers and splitters in the world. Some people like to clump everything together and can sort of see the big picture. Other people like to split and take things down to their thematic and siloed approach, and we need both. I love clumpers and splitters. Some days a clumper, some days a splitter, so we need it all. And we do have an opportunity now to engage in the integrated strategies, the new strategies, so the disability inclusion equity strategy, the LGBTQI+ strategy, the gender strategy, and the revitalised humanitarian strategy. But we'll possibly find ourselves as a sector and as stakeholders going back down to well, that's the gender strategy. We'll talk about the gender stuff in the gender strategy. I think we've actually got an opportunity to keep that coherence that Matt, I think you mentioned, and to elevate that at the integrated level, because that's, I think, one of the really strong points of this development policy, that we actually can see the integrated impact of those. But we have to make sure we do that. Otherwise, we'll risk just taking things back down to those thematic or potentially siloed strategies. So again, no real answer to anything. Lots of exciting conversations, I think, for us to have in the weeks and months ahead.
Thanks, Anthea. Cate, please.
Last but hopefully not least. Well, thank you very much. I'd like to start by acknowledging traditional owners of the land in which we live and vulnerable people, and my respects to elders past and present, and just acknowledge this beautiful campus that we're on, and with some regret that I didn't take the time to enjoy it more when I was here. I thought I'd talk about three broad areas: the target, some of the challenges in implementation, and then I wanted to talk a little bit just around finance. And I know we'll have time for questions afterwards, so we may touch on some other issues after that. First, the target. I know there's a lot of interest in how we arrived at this. I will start with some frankness. When we were in 21-22, we were working off a base of 26% of activities having a climate objective. So one of the big challenges for us, and it will come as no surprise, was the cupboard was pretty bare on climate activities in DFAT, and that was a large factor in how we thought about how we actually integrate a target or come up with a target that would be implementable. So in fact, that really drove it. Of course, in climate, you are obviously there is a massive tension between the urgency of the crisis and the implementation capability. So we've had to balance that. We were looking for the right balance. So that's why we've arrived at the two targets, the 50% by 24-25 and the 80% by 28-29. Those who are familiar with the history of gender integration, it will come as no surprise to you that we are definitely jumping on that bandwagon and taking a twin track approach, so mainstreaming and undertaking new climate programming. And also we thought really long and hard about how we integrate climate into the planning process, the new planning processes, because there's a number of different countries are working at very different paces in relation to this. So when you think about your international climate negotiations and UNFCCC stuff, you know, there are a few documents that sort of are involved in that. So nationally determined contributions, national adaptation plans. The reality is there is not consistent, not every country that we deal with has those. On top of that, we were really cognizant that we did need to fully integrate climate risk. So we've been quite specific in each DPP or development partnership plan will be informed by a high-level climate risk brief and a separate one on GENSI, and that we expect them to take into account all governments' climate policy. So whether they have an NDC, whether they have a NAP, they should be acknowledged. Noting that capability and familiarity with some of this language is not it's not consistent across the department, certainly not at posts. in my team, we've been pulling together 2 pages to kick off some of these processes, just drawing out some of the key data. And I will acknowledge Fiona, because Fiona is sitting in the audience, and you know, we've had long discussions about how much we should spoon feed country programs, but in the end, you know, Fiona's done a great job with the team in putting those together. I wanted to talk briefly about the climate finance target. The government does have one. It's just to expend $2 billion in climate finance between the period of 2020 and 2025. In 2024, in May 2024, the negotiations will provide us with another type or another opportunity to reformulate a target. That's the process around something that's called a new quantitative collective goal. So we expect to understand what that will be and what that will look like next year. So we are operating on the basis that we need to be prepared to respond to how the negotiations fall on that. But whatever happens, we need to be integrating climate into the development program as much as we can, because it's the right thing to do in the face of such a changing environment, and also to be lifting our climate-specific programming. I think I've probably hinted at some of the challenges. I think of this as, you know, this is the greatest economic transformation since the Industrial Revolution for countries as they transition away from reliance on fossil fuel. It's just massive. And I think the real challenge in this space is that Australia is doing it at the same time that we're trying to assist countries in the region to do it with the development program. I'm really cognizant that that there's going to be tensions between where that workforce, that domestic workforce, sits and where it focuses, and the workforce we have available for assisting with international development. And what I'm keen to avoid, and I'm sure people who worked in governance programs will agree, is this situation where we make an offer to support partner governments through government-to-government aid, and we can't meet it and we can't sustain it because the 1 or 2 people who have an interest in international work move on, and we're just leaving partners high and dry. So we want to do this in a sustainable way and a thoughtful way, noting that there will be massive mismatches between expectations and delivery. A lot of those actually play out in finance as well, as we can well imagine. So on to finance, it's a nice segue. So the Minister and Rob both touched on the development finance review. Obviously, the scale of the challenge in transitioning and at the same time dealing with adaptation challenges is just on a scale that we've just never seen before. It's really interesting how it's playing out in relation to international development banks and a whole range of financing tools. I was at the Paris Summit earlier this year, and there was a lot of anger in the room around climate finance in particular, and the failure of developed countries to meet expectations, so both to meet the annual $100 billion climate finance goal, but also more generally. You know, we're dealing, it was predominantly African leaders there. We're dealing with a lot of countries facing famine, food insecurity, rising costs of food imports, and just a feeling that they just can't cope with the expectations around climate and development challenges simultaneously. So versions of that conversation are playing out in MDB boards all over the world at the same time. So the financial challenges are huge. The private sector obviously has a role to play, but I want to caution that it is not the silver bullet. So when we think about blended finance, for example, We've been talking about its potential for a very long time, and it has yet to meet those expectations. Same with institutional investment in large infrastructure projects. I used to co-chair the G20 working group on infrastructure, and I swear for at least 15 years we've been talking about this $70 trillion in institutional funds. If only we could intermediate that into where the funding is needed. It's just much harder than people think it should be. You know, we get sort of one-off wins, but it doesn't change the system. And I think, if I'm really frank, there are very few people who can look at a financing landscape, sort of see the forest from the trees and see the different kinds of financing that you need to resolve different situations. So there's real silos in how we approach financing, and that's just a real challenge when we're dealing with a multi-sectoral climate crisis. So I just wanted to leave that with you, just throw that dead cat on the table, because, you know, this is, I think, going to be one of the hardest things for us to get out into our next country.
Thanks so much, Kate.
Thank you so much. There's so much in there. I don't really know where to start, so I'm going to throw straight to the end. So, but it, the people with roaming rights. Oh, that's next. And maybe stand up if you've got a question, so the people with the roaming mics can actually see you. Or put your hand right up, don't be shy. That's it. That's it. Yeah, perfect.
Thank you. Is this on? There we go. Ollie May from Deloitte. First of all, thank you very much to the panel for an extremely insightful set of points. Lots to think about, as my pages and notes will attest. Just one question for the whole panel, really. One of the challenges with talking about climate change in an international development context is that international development, you know, being based on evidence-based sustainable change, tends towards a more careful, slower, long-term game. But climate change is extremely urgent, and we need to think about it, in my view, in like a humanitarian crisis. Now, obviously, the department's target is extremely laudable, it's extremely pragmatic, but obviously the exam question is where to from here. But my question to the panel is, how do we work together as a sector to get there faster? How do we accelerate?
Yeah, well, good question. I might, well, we get, we'll go to that question, speak to that question first. Who would like to respond to that? Because it does feel urgent and immense, and we don't operate that way in the sector. And yeah, so.
I don't have an answer, but I can establish some possibilities. In the World Bank and some of the MDBs, the UK government as well is talking about transformational change as a theme of how to approach some of the urgent challenges. So incremental change when it comes to climate change adaptation is just embedding capital where it's trapped. It's a stranded asset. If you just incrementally improve a little bit on what you're doing, and you keep growing wheat in central New South Wales, eventually you just wasting your money by way of illustration. I know that's not a development sector. So putting some thinking around what it is to make transformational change, what are the metrics for that, some structures around that so that we can, it's not so much about accelerating, it's about making bigger changes with the investments that we have, I think is part of the solution. And there has been some good work done in that space. So I think we could, I haven't really seen it in the Australian context, but I think we can learn from that and apply it to some of our development thinking here.
The other thing, you know, I'd add to that, I think, yes, like it is definitely a transformational change. I think universities are a very important partner in that. And, you know, I was at the work that the ANU has done around the Grand Challenge for zero carbon energy in the Asia Pacific has started thinking across a range of different areas where that transformational change can occur. The other thing I think is that the organisations need to actually start to become a bit more agile because of the urgency of this challenge. And that's something, one of the areas where I think public green banks have been very interesting. You know, the Australia CFC has deployed almost as much finance as the Green Climate Fund over the virtually the same time frame. That's because they have very robust sort of evaluation structures. They pivot to different areas as needed. They obviously are working in far less complex environments because we have conventional liquid markets, strong institutions and very other factors, but there are lessons that can be learned from that. And so I would say that actually having evaluation processes that you know, move in the direction of the policies, the DFAT policies as outlined is a really great step. But I think that the UN Secretary General said it best a few months ago, where he said, you know, now is the time. It's everything, everywhere, all at once, and we need to be able to learn from failures. And yes.
Frank, oops, is that on? No, I didn't say.
Yeah, frank and fearless is what we were invited to be. And so you're right, Ollie, we need to actually be acting a lot quicker. One of the ways you can act a lot quicker is by putting your money where your mouth is a lot faster, right? So this is speaking globally. So we know that what's being promised in terms of, you know, investment in climate and climate finance is nowhere near those commitments from the global governments. I know, Cate, you mentioned that there's a revision of the target here in Australia. But one of the ways to scale up is to scale up the resource, and unfortunately that is also going to be part of the money question that we have to grapple with. And then you've got to have the capabilities, you've got to have the systems, you've got to have the rigour around that, but you can't scale unless you put the money in there as well.
It strikes me that it's a radical departure from the way development business has been done to date. So, for example, the models that we've used to contract and implement and so forth, and completely new and different implementing partners are needed to support this. I don't see that sort of shift needs to take place in the way, in that transferring of the resources, I think, from DFAT to what needs to happen.
Well, I'm happy to comment on that. I think we all have choices, and when we I'll probably get myself into enormous trouble for revealing this data, but you know, when we looked at our ANCP program, only 10% of it counted like was climate appropriate or climate counted as climate finance. So that means our NGOs are not doing climate programs in the Pacific or elsewhere. So yes, we all need to lift our game and lift it quickly. I mean, you know, I was a little bit shocked by that figure because I don't think that you can kind of understand it. Why DFAT, there was a chilling effect on DFAT. It was harder to understand when it came to NGOs. So whether that is a capability issue, that's certainly something, you know, I think we need to step up more and support capability across the sector, because, you know, we've all got an interest in this. I think there's challenges with science as well. Like, I mean, I think climate has been the purview of scientists, and I know, because we've heard it from people in the Pacific, that that's a real challenge for them getting access to finance. If they can't get those climate scientists to show why building a new toilet is an adaptation project, they can't get access to GCF funds. So, you know, there's real issues with how the international global architecture around climate has been arranged. And I think, you know, if there was some way, and certainly we'd be up for it, to move that away from such a heavy reliance on a limited set of technical expertise and just acceptance. You know, the science is here, we know what to do. We, you know, local people know how to do their adaptation. Just a little bit, you know, of loosening of that, I think would also help funds to flow, because the funds just get stuck. And sorry, NGOs. I didn't mean to pick on you, it was just the only figure I had on my head.
So there's
So many hands, we don't know what to do. Yeah, yes.
Hi, I'm Soraya Orange from United World. Live on Dunruggle land in Sydney. It's a slightly different tack to this question. Talking about doing big things quickly, but also in the context of localization, looking at development response. We do current programming right across the Pacific, and we're a faith-based agency. Our local partners are one of the largest and influential civil society organizations, but what we hear back from them is they don't really see what we're doing as just the development sector slice. They see us as Australia. And there is some of that anger you were talking about, Cate, is that this framing of the work as resilience and adaptation when they want to hear about redress and loss and damage as well. But more, they want to know what Australia is doing to stop being the contributor to the problem. In the development policy, we have a commitment to support our partners to meet the Paris targets, but there isn't necessarily an explicit acknowledgement that unless Australia shows much stronger action on our own turf about what we do, our partners struggle to take us seriously and be genuinely meaningful partnership. I know this is an outside development sector question, but we have to do something to shift this conversation. What should we do?
So, blankets. I'll take another question first. So Stephen's got a question and Ken's got a question. No, Stephen.
All right, thank you. Just to inject a. Okay, sorry, just to inject maybe a contrary view. I mean, I think there's a contradiction between talking about climate crisis and having a government that's saying the aid program isn't going to increase beyond inflation for the next 10 years. So I'm surprised that hasn't come up. And, you know, I'm a critic of the 80% target. You know, health and education is about 30% of the aid program. So is DFAT planning to cut health and education? Or how will you shoehorn that into your climate change target? Thank you.
Okay. Two excellent questions there that we might spend some time talking about. I'm going to take one more. Others. First hand I saw. And we have a microphone. All right, here we go.
Alison Petty from DFAT. Having worked and built and delivered large infrastructure projects for a range of donor agencies and within numerous Pacific and Asian countries, I've worked with large multidisciplinary teams, architects, engineers, scientists, and all the other advisory services and specialists that go into providing good infrastructure. I think you're absolutely right. The resourcing is absolutely critical. There are just not enough young engineers, young scientists with good understanding, good educational background, or people that have, and they're also not being able to access development space very easily. So one of my, I guess, challenges is how do we engage with the technical specialists that will actually provide development outcomes, as well as the right technical inputs to build and develop this policy and to come out with really good examples that can be used by all of us to then promote and build on climate change outcomes in infrastructure especially.
Thank you. And one more thing.
Cate, I was really glad to see you start talking about local communities and civil society in another way of addressing the resilience and unlocking that kind of that step up and that acceleration. You know, when we go, sorry, I'm only experienced from Paradise, Australia. I mean, when we go out to our Pacific partners society, there are people everywhere who have a huge need for seawalls, mangroves, all the sorts of climate adaptation needs, and it's all known at the local community level. So I know that at the moment, the society put together the Cate Pacific Climate Community Fund, which is going to be using a network of liaison partners throughout the Pacific to kind of unlock to use their own money to give it to those local communities. But I guess, you know, my question to the panel is, what is the role of, you know, of local communities in unlocking and accelerating resilience and that knowledge of where things are, rather than having this top-down approach where the direct line fund takes 5 years to even get you know, the various sort of climate finance into it.
Okay. Thanks for that. So there's 4 questions in there. I'm going to remember this one was like, oh, sorry, it's a bit on
Sorry, it's not you, but a problem. Question in relation to how do we really take on this challenge when we're part of the problem and everybody knows it, like in the Pacific. So that's pretty tough. The 80% target, does that mean, you know, other really core things like health and education are going to go down again? And the issue of needing more technical capability, like the supply to make this happen, and the issue of resourcing again, which has come up a few times. So I'll hand over to Chell first.
Well, I guess I went to all of those, but the one area I think that there sort of comes across a few of these questions is, you know, how do we build local capability and the skills that are needed. And Matt, you touched before the Australia Awards program and the huge success that it has had. You know, in my role at the ANU, I teach master classes for, you know, MPs and for climate finance specialists that come over regularly. There is enormous appetite for these programs in Australia and across the world. And in the undergraduate and postgraduate courses I teach, you know, there is such interest in this work. And so I think there's a rapid need to scale up these programs in universities, and that's a huge opportunity for Australia. But I also think that one of the great sort of areas of capability within the climate movement is the climate youth movement. And these are the people that are committed to the public good and will stay working on these issues long term. You know, I started my career in that movement myself, and 15 years later, here I am still working on the same issues, which I'll be doing for the next 15. And so I think one of, you know, this very underutilized resource is a logical area for Australia to be targeting through the Australia Awards program. And one of the things that I've proposed in my work is that you extend the program to have an Australia Awards program for Pacific climate youth leaders, for Southeast Asian climate youth leaders, to train them to be the engineers, the architects, the development practitioners, and the climate specialists that we need. Seems like very low-hanging fruit, and, you know, in all of my interactions with international student colleagues at the ANU, I'm always very mindful that I could be talking to the next SBY or the next leader of a particular country. It is one of Australia's core and most successful foundations of our diplomacy, and to me, it's a no-brainer that we should be looking to scale it up. And then the other point I would make is, yes, there is a huge funding deficit, and we need to be upping that finance substantively. Yes.
Great, good call. On the what do we do about it? We're embarrassingly still exploring and drilling oil and gas. Well, let's stop doing that. The question about the what do we cut? Does it mean that health and education get cut? I think is a, you know, it's a pretty pointed question, and maybe others might have comments on that. But I think that part of the solution is to have climate in those programs, and what does it mean to really integrate climate into education? Like, how do we do that and make the education system an entry point for climate change actions in the communities of the schools, etc.? Are you shaking your head? And because I think you disagree, but I think we have to tackle that. I don't know exactly what the answer is, but if we don't tackle that, we're missing something. So I think that's part of it. That's, I think, probably where we'll strongly agree is there should be more money in the development program. So the part of the solution is greater resources, and let's see that 2.5%, the 25% per year rather than 2.5%. So maybe that would be ambitious. The question on local community resilience. Yeah, you can't turn around the Pacific without having a conversation about climate change, right? And a lot of people have a lot of ideas about what they need to do. I think one of the challenges there is to ensure that you don't have this incrementalism. I agree with you. Most of the time, local people understand what's needed locally. They just need the resources to be able to do that. I think we do need to have an overlay on where the magnitude of the climate hazard manifestation is greater than what incremental changes can respond to. We need to make sure that people aren't over-investing in those incremental changes. So that's not really an answer, that's just a comment in addition to. And on the capacity question, I think it's a great idea. I think we should do that. Why not? Let's just agree to do that and move forward. It's kind of agree to do that now. I think there's several other programs and engaging the university system in Australia. It's when you travel around our region, you always end up meeting people that were educated here or some kind of other education was done in Australia. It creates this incredible bond, and to me, it's the most effective diplomacy that Australia has because they almost universally love having been here. It's one of the great times of their lives, and you have this bond with people and an entry point straight away. So if we can advance that and increase that and engage that on the climate issues, then we might have a chance to make more progress more quickly. Thanks.
I'm probably going to mangle all different parts of all the questions together, but a couple of points. So currently it's estimated that only around 10% of global climate financing actually gets to locally led solutions or people that have been involved in those locally led ideas. So there's a problem right there. It's a structural access to climate financing question. So I think there's got to be some cut through. It's going to be a political process, I think, to get that cut through in terms of changing some of the barriers that actually exist to why access to that climate finance is not actually having the impact that we want, and definitely not as quickly as that impact should be happening. We do have a moment in time at the moment, though, we're talking loss and damage, in terms of the design of loss and damage funds, that has to actually, we say our development policy has locally led and local communities and partnership at the centre of it. Our contribution to the global conversations around the design of loss and damage funds and funding and mechanisms and all the, the bureaucratic process that's going to go around that has to learn from the problems of the global, the Green Climate Fund and other global financing mechanisms, right? So there is a critical role that Australia needs to and can play at both the political level, but also then in civil society and the relationships that we have with partners and the local solutions that we hear and see every day, the relationship that we bring as civil society into that political conversation that we need to take forward in terms of the design of the loss and damage fund. But we also need to do that quickly because, as you said, we're being slapped around the knuckles and wrist, and we have been for decades, around our contribution and those that are the least contributing to the climate crisis, as we know in this room, are suffering the most. That possibly goes to your question of coverage, though, this morning, Brian, as well, in terms of how do we actually have that statecraft, it's around a statecraft conversation. What does that mean for the trade-offs and the political conversations we're also willing to have as a country? And what role does civil society play in that? What role do our development partners, be they governments across the Pacific or the region, or civil society and or private sector across the region? What is that appetite, I guess, that we have for really saying that we're centering the climate crisis at the forefront of the urgency that we would need to have? There's a sort of a practice in humanitarian action that while you've got a really smart, dedicated resource team focusing on the here and now and the immediate needs, you've got to have an equally smart, dedicated resource team focusing on the next, the later, the future track. And I don't think we've got that balance quite right. So I think actually collectively we also need to be thinking the immediate mitigation activities that we need to be funding, that we need to be supporting, we need to be measuring, we need to be adapting, we need to do all of those things. Don't stop doing that. I guess that's the where to from here. Some things are pretty simple, and sometimes simple works. So don't throw out the simple, the effective, just because we've got to do other things with more urgency. Keep doing those things, but then actually focus on the next and the future track as well. And I think we can. Maybe that's the clumpers and the splitters amongst us as well, though, is we need to be constantly bringing those conversations back together again.
There's a lot in what both other panelists have said and the questions are asked. So I'm going to go in a very random order. I first wanted to just make a point, build on something Anthea said around the loss of damage fund. That process is ongoing now, and I think it would be not unreasonable to say that an overriding bit of feedback we've had from the Pacific is please don't replicate the GCF. So I had the honour of going to a loss and damage workshop in Samoa a couple of months ago, and there was a very large focus on the desire for that to be the new fund to provide, access for localised fund solutions and for it to be programmatic. When I dug under the surface in some of those conversations, I realised that there was not a shared understanding of what programmatic meant. Everyone had a different idea. So that was challenging, and some of the ideas that were coming up just would require flex in the international architecture that just isn't there. I think, if we're completely honest, I'm talking about direct budget support, those sorts of things. As people will know, Australia does provide budget support, but we provide it through mechanisms, and there are requirements around fiduciary kind of and audit and a whole bunch of other public financial management issues. So there was it was kind of a depressing kind of meeting. Also, knowing what I knew about what's going on in the negotiations added to the sort of depression on that score. Issues around how do we define vulnerability, and attempts by very, very large countries that emit a lot to change the criteria so that they were also included in that definition of the most vulnerable under the UNFCCC, so that they could also access the loss of damage fund. And as anyone who's worked on the Pacific will know, it's just, this region is bearing the brunt. They're so vulnerable. And to think that, by virtue of the international negotiations, they may lose access to this, or they may not get the access they deserve to this fund. It's just, it's very challenging for those of us who care. So we, just to reassure you, we are sort of, we're contingency planning, but it's an active kind of negotiation, and watch this space, because we'll have an idea in COP this year where that will land. On the issue of Australia's commitments to climate and how that is perceived in the context of the climate challenge. Look, I think there's broad awareness that that it is an issue. The government has, as everyone in this room will be aware, made some fairly substantial commitments on the climate front. The new NDC, the agreement to 83% renewables in the grid, and I think it's fair to say there's a fairly honest dialogue with partners in the region about the challenges that we face in transforming our economy. But also the challenge that we face in our region with that tension between being a reliable source of some fossil fuels for some of our very near neighbours. This is not a simple issue. Even if we look at this in the Pacific, we have countries that cannot move to completely renewable energy very quickly. They are reliant on diesel, and they will need plans to get off that. Now, sure, they don't emit very much. That's not really the point for them. Where they want to change to renewables, it's going to take some time. So I think the issue with the speed of the transition is one that we just need to take out of the UNFCCC politics and just have some pragmatic kind of discussions about. On the issue of, I think I've touched on the locally led issue. I mean, I think on that, the thing that does concern me is how do you get the funds down? So people may or may not be aware that there is a Pacific Islands Forum initiative called the Pacific Resilience Facility. When I was sitting in those talks in Samoa, it was very clear to me that really much of what they're asking for was being designed into the Pacific Resilience Facility. So Pacific Resilience Facility is meant to be a capitalised trust fund, and the proceeds of that fund will be dispersed to countries in the region for locally led adaptation. So, you know, that's one option. There will still be sort of design issues that are very challenging in that, but I think we just have to make it work a couple of times, and then we, you know, once we crack it, it should be scaled up. I think that's the key to some of this, and sort of rolling some of this out with more speed. I completely agree on the capability front. I mean, we do, you know, short courses and things like that. You've actually instigated quite a number of those. That's not enough. So, you know, I think the challenge is, and I don't underestimate it, particularly in engineering, because we've also got, you know, AUKUS, various other big spending items as well. Not to mention the impacts of the IRA on pulling Australian engineers to the States to work on renewable energy. Like, there's so much going on around the world that is going to pull those resources away from here. And I think part of the solution in that is actually, particularly on the big infra, is to work more with trusted partners in the region. And frankly, that's tricky because we as America tend to be more flexible than our American or our Japanese or other counterparts, but we just have to make it work. And I think we're making some good progress on that. So there's been some big inroads. I think that's
yeah. Thanks. Very impressive here, but I've ignored this under yet, but I've ignored the Slido even more.
No questions.
Okay, there's no question. So one here and the other. Okay.
Yes.
Nobody wants to ask.
Sorry, Stephen, I just did that to annoy you. Look, the 80%, I mean, it's absolutely right, but you just expect it to be mainstreamed. And so some of it will be picking up that. You know, I generally don't think, given the impacts of climate change, they're a force accelerator on every development badge you can think of. I really like if there's any excuse not to do it. So I don't anticipate that there will be a decrease in education and health funding. I mean, I'd like to see more. I'd like to see an increase in education funding because I can see there's been a decrease over time. I'd also like to see an increase in food and agriculture because, you know, we're not looking at flash on that, and that is, you know, and that is the core of climate action. So I think as the new policy is sort of, you know, people acclimatise to it and the performance frameworks, people become used to them. I think we will actually find that climate is integrated into the development stream as it should be.
The other part of your question, Stephen, I think went to the bigger, broader question. So obviously, and it was announced recently at the ALP International Conference that there is a recommitment to the 0.5. Obviously, the 0.5 is not 0.7. Obviously, the 0.7 is not enough. So I think, you know, on behalf of the aid sector here, we will continue to be the voice that actually wants to know what that looks like. It's not just good enough to have that as a policy commitment. The implementation, the commitment, the drive towards that will certainly be something that we will be watching very carefully, but also engaging on these kinds of conversations around, well, if we're increasing, what are we increasing for what impact, and with whose voices around those tables to design those programs. So that's certainly something we can rest assured that this part of the civil society is certainly be focused on.
So
got enough time for one more round of questions. If you've got a microphone in your hand, could you stand up? 1, 2. I'm just gonna take around and throw the microphone here. Better not give you mine, but 1, 2, second microphone, and then Michael. Yes, please.
Okay, thank you. Hi everyone, thank you for the great discussion. This is Ashmita from the International Organization for Migration. We're also implementing a lot of projects on climate infrastructure and policy and supporting locally led solutions. And although predominantly local actors to support climate mitigation and resilience projects, there's also an emerging conversation on exploring planned relocation pathways, both within countries and between countries. So my question is to the panelists, and I guess for general discussion, is there any thinking around supporting planned relocation, both again within countries and between countries, and how is it that the development community can support navigating this conversation, keeping in mind that it is a very sensitive conversation, especially for countries in the Pacific, who staying in place as the first option, but also keeping in mind that it's the reality of the situation that a lot of them might not be able to stay in their homes for a really long time. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Bernie Roland from the Australian Sustainable Finance Institute, and thanks for a really fantastic discussion so far. My question is for Cate. So the development process and timing for Australia might start to develop its next climate finance target. You mentioned the sort of negotiations and the timeline for the new quantified collective goal. What I'm anticipating is that since our target ends in 2025, there's a little bit of urgency to develop the next one, which I assume will be to the 2030, the 2025-2030 period. And I was around the last time in DFAT working with Andrew, and the last time Australia put forward a new climate finance target, it wasn't a particularly consultative process at that time. Very different kind of context that we're in now. I was just wondering if there will be a consultation process for that, how you go about engaging kind of different views. Obviously, it's a decision for the government. There's a lot of factors to weigh up. I think there are questions around not just the quantum of the target, but also how it's delivered and what the capabilities are that kind of draw on a lot of the really positive signs we've seen coming out of DFAT development policy, with the development finance review, with the Southeast Asia economic engagement strategy. And in particular, I think to this comment around mainstreaming, one of the kind of challenges of delivering climate finance in the Australian government has been that a lot of it's just given straight to the NDBs, at which point we lose a lot of influence. And then most of the rest is delivered through posts. Posts change over personnel every few years. It's quite hard to develop and retain capacity at many different posts. What there hasn't been is a sort of bucket of a portfolio of funds that can be delivered kind of centrally, or at least kind of centrally in partnership with posts. And that's what a lot of other countries do. And it really allows you to develop expertise, retain that expertise, and think strategically and regionally, and kind of also interface with other agencies who could be delivery partners for that climate finance as well. So I'm interested in your thoughts on that.
Thank you. And one more question, and then we're going to have to wrap up. And Michael's got the microphone.
Thanks, Bernadette. So I'm Michael List from eWater. We run water security and water resource management programming for DFAT in a range of places. So really for the whole panel, I'm a fan of the clumping and splitting analogy, and I guess I'm arguing for a bit more clumping and a bit less splitting in this question. We have a range of strengths in Australia relating to climate change and managing climate change in a development context. But we also have this 10, 12-year credibility problem around international climate negotiations. So it would seem to me that there's some low-hanging fruit in areas where we already have recognition of really good. Water resource management, I would say that with no, but agriculture and food security, I think also. But I did have a very recent conversation with the team in DFAT where they said, look, there's going to be less room in the program now for water security budget, because we've got this climate financing target to meet. And my response was, what? So in terms of the funding question, what's standing in the way, if anything, for us to be counting our programming in water security in areas where climate change impacts express themselves in our region, water security, agriculture, and food security, to count us the climate target? And is it a level of understanding and expertise in the development community inside DFAT which seems to silo these issues from each other?
Yeah. Okay, thanks, Michael. Let's go. We've got 8 minutes left. So who would like to take on one of the questions and we'll start with from there?
It was a very specific one to Cate.
Yeah.
Great. Okay, so just to quickly answer, Michael, there's no conflict. Water security is a climate issue. So for those who don't know, our climate accounting, the rules are vaguely set by the UNFCCC. We follow the Rio markers, and we have to report formally on that. Water is a sector that I would expect should be fully climate financed. So there shouldn't be any problems with that. We know the high-level panel on climate finance that was done for last year's COP identified 2 or 3 areas where there needed to rapidly be a scale up in finance. One was obviously the energy transition, no surprises there. The other was restoration of natural capital, if you want to call it that. A large part of that was water, but it's also, it would encompass things like nature-based solutions for climate, rehabilitation of wetlands, etc. And the third area, quite specifically, was climate resilient agriculture. I think we're really underdone on that, given that we're in the worst global food security crisis in living history. So yes, it's pretty. Look, a couple of things on that. I think yes, we are thinking about the new target. We've just been discussing that a lot of people don't understand. And there's a need for us to get out and consult. So I guess I'm making the offer now. We have relatively frequent consultations, I think, with the AgFed climate finance group, but I think it'd be useful if we also reached out to some others just to explain the ABC of climate finance accounting, because it's actually quite tricky. People may not be aware, for example, that we can count private finance mobilised in our climate finance target. And I don't have any ethical issue with that, given the scale of the challenge that we have to meet. So that's kind of step one. We have to kind of ready both other government departments and the sector for what does climate finance type mean? How do we account for it? What's the process? Is it dollar for dollar, dollar in, dollar out? Because as you know, it isn't a dollar in, dollar out in climate finance. The broader question around how we address the needs to work more on development finance instruments in the context of climate. I mean, that's obviously something that I've thought about a lot. I think it's going to be critical. We think about the challenge in Southeast Asia as being one of a bit easier to tackle in terms of managing and pulling in private finance, and ADI has shown itself to be a really effective mechanism for that because it is unique in the sort of landscape, and we've got proof of that. But we have to think one part about adaptation finance as well, and that is it's much harder. So my sense is we've got to be super creative. Do we have the skills to do it? I think it goes to the point I made earlier that there's very few people who can lift their gaze and look across all different financing instruments and you know, choose which one is best for which circumstance. And in essence, that's what we have to do for the government in creating the new climate finance. We need to go to them and say, you know, you might get to this if you do this, you might get to this if you get to this, and give them those choices. And in doing that, we have to have a fairly robust kind of capacity to do cost benefit analysis on each of those options. And part of that will be looking at the capability issues. Just briefly on the issue of relocation, I think that's a really tricky question. So we've already, I mean, you'd be aware that Fiji already has a policy on relocation, and people have been relocated in Fiji. This is something that I think, you know, we need to, I mean, this obviously needs to be very much country-led, and it's, you know, and even within countries, incredibly difficult conversations to have. So yes, we have thought about it, but I have to be frank and say I don't think I've got a solution about how we're best placed to respond to it.
So the one thing that I would add to all of Kate's excellent points is I think the question around relocation also raises this question of climate risks and understanding climate risks deeply. And, you know, I mean, the panel of investing in resilience is often understood in an adaptation or a disaster management context. But actually, I think, you know, it also needs to be considered in terms of the resilience of our international financial architecture, the resilience of all of the other broader kind of systems. And so my final point would just be that understanding climate risks is going to be really critical to being able to trade off and sort of make the best decisions in this context. And so that is an area definitely domestically that I know is huge focus, but internationally, I think as we see the TCFD and disclosure standards sort of rolled into ISSB, you know, that needs to be another huge area of focus for Stella.
Thanks, Chell.
Can I just make two concluding comments? So I'm not sure if I'm a coupler or a splitter on your question, and I know there's accounting processes and standards, but we do need to, even though we're really focused on the climate crisis, we need to not fall into the trap to say everything becomes climate finance. So we need to be clear about what those accounting processes are, the standards that we're using. Otherwise, we will sort of say, oh, we've made our climate finance target because I've added 2 + 2 and I got 12. So we really need to be clear about what we are saying, what we're not saying, and we need to be focused more on the impact than the target, I think is the message I'd like to leave on that point. And on the migration point, you're right, it is so fraught, it is so heartbreaking. And so I'd also come back to my opening comment, which is what do we lose when communities, particularly First Nations and Indigenous communities, are forced to move? They lose their connection to culture, to country, all those things that Auntie Carolyn shared with us about her love of her country and the welcome that we all received. That's what we lose globally as a community, if we're not addressing the urgency of the climate crisis that we're facing and not putting people, communities and governments and everyone in those heartbreaking situations to have to move, often not by choice. But there are people that migrate by choice, but a lot of the people we're talking about are forced to move.
Yeah, it's working some.
Well, I'd add to that, I hard to disagree with that very briefly. Then there's no world in which water security is not part of climate adaptation. That's madness. So we just need to find a way to make sure it's included. On the migration question, so the Australian government has the Pacific Labour Facility and the humanitarian logistics C, and the Pacific Entry Visa, PEV, I think is what it stands for. Someone in DFAT is putting those dots together, and someone's thinking about what does it mean to have that mobility between your home country and Australia, and how can you use remittances as part of the development solution and that much bigger picture? I don't know who using DFAT is thinking about that, but someone's got a good idea. I think it would be helpful if we could put a climate overlay on that so that you could understand where it is really a climate issue and where it's economic migration, etc. I think there's an interesting piece to play there. I also just finally, the last comment I want to say, sometimes with our DFAT colleagues, we get frustrated because they're not doing everything we want them to do. But I think that they're in an interesting time and tough challenges, and I think, as a community, we work together to find the best solutions and the best way forward with the resources we have. So I look forward to working with all of you going forward. Thanks.
Okay, well, a big thank you to you. Thank you very much. And apologies, I didn't get to everybody's questions.
All right, thank you very much to our panel. We're now going to break for morning tea. It's only 20 minutes, so please run and drink and come back.